discussing the paper which the Core Internet Values Dynamic Coalition has put together for this IGF. My name is Olivier Crépin-Leblond. I'm the chair of the coalition. And next to me is Matthew Shears, who's one of our panelists today, and Vint Cerf, further down. The agenda for today is going to be first discussing the paper for the first half an hour or so of the session. And then the second half an hour, we'll be discussing internal Core Internet Value DC coalition work and planning forward as to how we're going to reorganize ourselves, I think, is the way forward, and maybe see if we're going to come up with some committees, etc. The session is supposed to be quite interactive, so we'll just start with reviewing the paper quickly, discussing a few parts of it, and then digging into the actual freedom from harm proposal, which is on the table today and which was proposed in our paper. So first, I guess, maybe should I just let Vint and Matthew say a few words? So start with Vint Cerf.
Well, bonjour, Monsieur le Président, and that's all the French you're going to get out of me in Genève. I just wanted to say that the notion of freedom from harm arose from the other language that we use about Internet: freedom of information, freedom of access, openness, permissionless innovation. All of these very important qualities need to be tempered with the recognition that this is not necessarily, the online environment is not necessarily the safest place in the world. We rely very heavily on the software in our laptops, our mobiles, our tablets, and of course in the cloud. And we know that the software, which makes the infrastructure, is not impervious to attack. And a consequence of this is that people who are using the network, I think, would like to feel that in addition to the freedoms that they have, that they are also safe. And I think this is an important property that we should seek to achieve. We will not achieve perfection, but the notion that we try and we educate to achieve this objective, I think, is very important. To say nothing of trying to build software and systems and practices that leave us safer than we would otherwise be. So freedom from harm is not a guarantee. There is also, I think, a potential political hazard in the use of the language, which I had not appreciated until it was pointed out to me, and that is that those organizations and even governments who wish to control the way in which the Internet is used may use this freedom from harm phrase to justify a variety of oppressive methods to inhibit the use of the network. And so we should be very careful about the slogans we choose, because they may be abused by those who do not agree with an open and freely accessible network. So the paper, I think, is a very important exploration of the concept of freedom from harm, the side effects that it might introduce. And that's why we're here today, to try to refine the idea and to try to achieve at least some of the objectives, which are mostly associated with making the Internet a safer place than it is today. So, Mr. Chairman, I think I'll stop there. That's more than enough from me. I hope that you'll forgive me for leaving at 9:30 when I have to go to another meeting. But I would like to hear as much as possible the discussion that will ensue.
Thank you very much, Vint. Next is Matthew Shears for opening comments.
Thanks, Olivier. The core value paper is very interesting. And I'll come to the freedom from harm in a minute. It raises a number of questions, and the one that I find, one that I'd like to come back to, and hopefully we can do that when we go through the paper, is this notion of whether or not core values themselves should could or will evolve over time. And I think it's something that we need to perhaps spend a little bit of time on. I'm also interested in thinking about, and this ties into freedom from harm, thinking about one core value that is, in my mind, is missing. And I'll come back to that as well, which is the notion of secure. And this touches on the freedom from harm very directly. I think then you've raised a couple of the concerns that I was going to raise with regards to freedom from harm, which is, in my mind, it's very much, and I think this is a good thing to have an interactive discussion about, it's very much a kind of an end state or a goal, something that we would want to see for the internet as a whole, but how we achieve that may be through a combination of those values and perhaps including another value that may get at some of that kind of core idea of ensuring the security and possibly the safety, although we might want to distinguish between those two concepts. So I think there are a couple of good meaty areas we can perhaps have a good dialogue with, and we have a relatively small group, so that I'm looking forward to that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Matthew. So the paper is online, and it's linked to the agenda for today's meeting. And we are collecting feedback online. There hasn't been very much feedback, in fact, for any of the Dynamic Coalition papers so far, so I do encourage you to provide feedback. But the core internet values, as we have defined in the past few years, are purely technical values. So we're not dealing with rights and principles and so on, which are dealt with by other coalitions. The ones that we have listed at present are that the internet is global. It's a global medium open to all, regardless of geography or nationality. It's interoperable, and that's, of course, the ability of a computer system to run any applicable programs from different vendors, etc. It's not vendor-specific. It's not operating system-specific. It's open as a network of networks, so any standard-compliant device can actually use the network, and that promotes a lot of innovation. It's decentralized, therefore free from any centralized control. It's end-to-end with application-specific features residing in the actual communication devices rather than the network being geared for specific applications. It's user-centric, and that's where the user effectively controls pretty much everything they want to do on the internet. And it's robust and reliable. This was the sort of shortest list that we managed to put together over the years, with some question as to whether further values should be added to this. Now, I know there are discussions going on in the Internet Society about this. In ICANN, the accountability thread had some discussion on these core Internet values as well. And one could also say that the discussion about network neutrality is something that is a breach, if you want, of core Internet values if network neutrality doesn't actually remain there. So the notion that Matthew has brought forward and saying, well, we haven't got secure listed in that set of values is something that we probably need to look at, and whether freedom from harm is actually equating to a secure in some way. Vint.
So this is an interesting question, because the term secure implies somehow freedom from interference, malicious interference. Achieving this usually involves a variety of technical applications, but it also involves behavior. For example, if we use usernames and passwords as a classic example of trying to limit who has access to your account, poor practices will leave you insecure. And one question is, how do we posture the system to achieve better security? And one example is not to use usernames and passwords, or at least not exclusively, but to introduce other mechanisms like two-factor authentication, end-to-end encryption, and other kinds of technical means. I guess I'd like to ask Matthew whether how you would like to interpret the term secure, because it turns out that the attack vectors against the Internet's architecture come at various layers in the structure. And so security is not the result of an action at some single layer at all. It's a series of defenses. So I'm interested to know how you'd like to interpret the term for best benefit.
Matthew Shears.
We're jumping straight into the hard one.
We only have 10 minutes.
Sorry, yes, we only have 10 minutes. I suppose that, it was my immediate reaction when looking at the list when compared to other norms or other lists of such norms that typically, although here it says robust and reliable, typically you would see stable and secure, for example. And it occurs to me that when we're talking about an environment where we want to achieve a state of freedom from harm, a lot of that is really in exactly that which you've described, which is a sense the responsibility for cyber hygiene. It's also ensuring there's the right level of security built into IoT devices. So there's a dimension to the notion of secure that I think is broader than just using a password. It's actually about the ecosystem as a whole. It's about ensuring that manufacturers place the right security within their devices and across their networks. So I think I don't have anything against freedom from harm. It's more the notion that I think that's kind of an end state of the applicability or abiding by these core values, and that's something that we want to achieve. And particularly because the odd man out in this list here, which I'm actually delighted to see, which is the notion of user-centric. And here we talk about user-centric, about control over information and data and things like that, but there's another dimension of user-centric, which is the responsibility to take on board that cyber hygiene and that responsibility for being effectively now nodes in a system. And I think in that sense that's also part of the freedom from harm, right? It's a responsibility that the user must assume. So it's a kind of is it a security or secure from a technological perspective that we should be looking at? Because this is largely a technical list, but it may also lie within the user-centric characteristic or core value as well.
So if you don't mind the back and forth a little bit.
That's absolutely fine, Vint.
So let's talk for just a moment about users and the tools that they are offered in order to protect themselves. We are derelict as technologists if we declare that the users are responsible for protecting themselves and we provide them with no tools to do that. Or we fail to provide them with an infrastructure that has the features that will allow users to protect themselves as long as they practice, we'll call it safe networking. So there is indeed a technical component to all of this. To give you a related example that I continue to worry a great deal about, this so-called Internet of Things or cyber physical systems, devices that have software in them that are attached to the Internet and are running more or less without any user control. They are autonomous pieces of software. The big concern I have is that the people who build that software and sell the devices that contain it may have very little interest in assuring that the device is safe from tampering or inappropriate control, because their motivation is to just sell something and then it doesn't matter what happens after that. That's an irresponsible attitude, but users are not necessarily in a position to assess whether the device they just purchased is in fact configured in a way that protects them. The most recent example that I know about, anyway, of a significant side effect is the attack against the Dyne Corporation by the Mirai botnet. The botnet herder, or general, if you like, by the way, was arrested, but not before a substantial amount of damage was done. 500,000 webcams were taken over in the botnet, and it was easy because they had no controls at all. And so it was easy to aim their megabit per second video streams to a common target. If you do the arithmetic, it's 500 gigabits a second of traffic aimed against one target on the network, which knocked the organization off the net. I consider the production and deployment of devices like this to be irresponsible. And I also think that the users, unfortunately, don't have any tools for detecting that they have a device which is unsafe in that respect. So it feels to me, I don't know, Matthew may disagree, but it feels to me like there are a panoply of different responsibilities that lie at the early stages of design and implementation of pieces of internet or devices that use it, all the way up to and including the users and the application space. And if we're going to achieve the goal of freedom from harm, we can only do so by a substantial amount of effort across a wide range of parties and practices.
Thank you, Vint. At this point in time, I'd like to get a bit of input and so on from participants on the floor. So Rolf Weber, and then perhaps we'll go around. So please introduce yourself, and then we'll continue.
Rolf Weber, University of Zurich. I just wanted to make a historical remark, so to speak. Of course, everybody would like to have secure communication, but in fact, 5 years ago, at the Wikid in Dubai in December 2012, there was a huge controversy regarding the term security. And notwithstanding the fact that everybody would like to have security, the interpretation of the term was quite different, and a good number of countries around the world interpreted security as possibility to restrict free flow of data because security was seen as part of sovereignty, of state public order. So I'm relatively reluctant to base the declaration too much on security.
Thanks. We have Teresa Swinehart next.
Hi, thank you. Just a question on this. There's oftentimes discussions around sort of the health of the internet and the health indicators around the internet, and then there's discussions around how to resolve cybersecurity related matters. And the core internet values really go to the heart of some of the underlying issues relating to this. What would be in an ideal world the next steps with regards to the values and how they might propagate into a wider acceptance of this is just how we need to function, similar to a clean environment or similar to other factors around that? I realize we don't want to leap to the solutions and next steps, but it seems like this is a fundamental part of a conversation around the DNA of the internet.
Since I will have to walk out the door in a couple of minutes, a very, very quick two points to consider. The first one is the devices on the network that are available, freely for purchase, for example, by the public, that contain software, might well look for some indication that they have been tested for safety and security. In the U.S., there's something called the Underwriters Laboratory, which tells us that electrical devices have been tested for safety. There's some interest in trying to evaluate the software of some of these devices in order to determine whether they appear to be safe to use. So that's one kind of tactic that we could imagine happening. I wanted to say one other thing, but I forgot what it was, so I'll stop.
Right, thank you, Vint. And I hear that the sound isn't working properly, apparently, so people on the phone can't hear us, but it's being taken care of. So thanks for coming in and giving us a few points on this. So Colin, please.
Hi, my name is Karen Kat. I'm a PhD student at the Oxford Internet Institute. And so I had a question about where this work fits in the larger debate, because there seem to be multiple debates going on. On the one hand, people saying like we need to protect the public core of the internet, other people saying we need to start bringing in ethical frameworks, third group saying we need human rights frameworks and have that be the basis, especially considering the fact that some of the principles that are in here are definitely worth pursuing, but are not in line with where the market is going. I spent a lot of time at the Internet Engineering Task Force, and for instance, end-to-end is increasingly harder with content delivery networks. So I was kind of wondering, what is the debate that this paper is trying to speak to?
Yeah, Vint, you're allowed to answer.
No, you just reminded me of something I wanted to say. The end-to-end notion has some great power to it, and at Google we ended up assuming that all the networks, including our own, were unsafe, and therefore we developed something called Beyond Corporation, which you might want to look at because we've advertised how it works to first order. And the whole idea is you assume that everything underneath you is unsafe, and you use end-to-end methods for strong authentication, strong encryption, and so on. So thank you for that reminder.
Thank you, Vint. So that's a very good point that you've made, and I think it's down to whether those core internet values should evolve. And the very fact that, yes, we do have content delivery networks that are skirting around the end-to-end scenario, and the internet is slowly evolving into a slightly different architecture, doesn't mean that the end-to-end core internet value should be deleted or removed as such. And I think that's one of the, kind of takes us to the next part of the discussion, which we'll start in a few minutes, which is as to whether we should have an observatory that actually looks at how the internet is evolving and which values are perhaps being broken or dropped, or and which values are being added. If we do agree that the values are not alienable and can evolve with time as the internet evolves with time. I think that the core internet values, when they started, didn't have in mind any kind of Internet of Things and all of the new devices that are now connected. If we were to stick to a core set of values and said, well, we can't move from that, then effectively we might end up having obsolete values as it goes. That's just something I'm throwing into the room, and I'd like to hear some feedback on this. Matthew?
Actually, I'd like to come back to the comment by the gentleman there, and also it touches on the freedom from harm. We've always assumed that the words security, stability, and resilience go hand in hand when it comes to talking about the network. What Vint is getting at is bigger than that, and it touches on some of the concerns that you raise. And I think it's true that we tend to interpret secure in absence of those other qualifying terms as something that's much broader than the network. So really we'll define, if secure is inserted into the paper, we would have to define it quite specifically. But I think one of the challenges, and I'm sorry that Vince left, but I think one of the challenges is he acknowledged it himself. When you talk about harm, that can mean many, many different things in many different cultures and under many different norm systems. So again, we risk by trying to achieve or insert that core value, we risk that as well. So it's we're kind of struggling with something that whichever way you turn, it starts to get you in a little bit of trouble unless you're very clear about what you mean. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. Does anyone have a suggestion as to what language could be inserted for freedom from harm or secure or something? Bearing in mind, I mean, I was over at Week at 12, and I was actually in the UK delegation, which was the one that was mostly against having secure being added to the paper. And the response was, well, let's call it robust rather than secure, in full knowledge that, well, robust means that it will not collapse under pressure, under attack, and so on. So it would mean that it is somehow secure in being able to defend itself from any attacks. But at the same time, it's a sort of more neutral word that cannot be misused for control of the network, including logins, passwords, strong identification, etc., that could evolve from that by saying, well, the only way to make it secure is to know absolutely everything about whoever is connecting on it. So I'd be interested in hearing some feedback and thoughts on this. How do we codify this into the core internet values? Matthew?
I think we need to bear in mind where the internet is evolving, in what ways it's evolving. Which would just take the case of IoT, as Vince and I were speaking earlier on. We must assume that both the user and the manufacturer of IoT devices is going to assume responsibility for connecting them to the device, to the network. And that means that the manufacturer must ensure that they're secure and that there are levels of security that can be upgraded and can be understood by the user, particularly if they're IoT devices that you're buying in a supermarket in 3 or 5 years, right? So I don't think that we can, I think we need to address the issue of security. We need to address it in a specific way. To do so, we would be remiss, and we'd also be kind of stepping aside from something that actually is going to become increasingly important when it comes to the overall resiliency and stability of the network. So we can't avoid security. It's how we describe it and how we address it is important.
Thank you, Matthew. Any thoughts in the room? Sébastien Bachelet.
Thank you very much, Sébastien Bachelet. I just want to ask you one question. Why you want to ask the innovation today to be more secure than the invention of the things before, and particularly Internet? Internet was not secure, and it was not meant for that, and it was not supposed to be what it is today. Then why you want to add something to the inventor to be more expensive for what they want to do, and maybe it will never work? And I understand why we need that, but in the same time, we may lose some innovation.
Yeah, thanks for this, Sébastien. I think, well, Vint mentioned earlier the Mirai botnet and the multiplication of attacks using weaknesses in security design, especially on things and devices that are now being connected. So that's perhaps one of the reasons why we're looking in that direction. Sébastien?
Yes, thank you, Olivier. But at the same time, we as end user, we want to have the cheapest IoT that we can. Then why we will ask for more security if it's a double of price or the triple of price, and then we will never buy it, and then it will never come to the market? It's something we need to take into account. Yes, I understand we need security, but how we can deal with that and with lose innovation? Thank you.
Thank you, Sébastien. Yesterday I saw a device which was $1 that apparently now provides with full Wi-Fi and connectivity, etc., that can be embedded in these systems. So maybe security can be added to this in one way or other, like some kind of a password or some kind of protocols. So the gentleman over on this side, please.
Thank you. I confess that I have not thoroughly read your paper for this DC, but it occurs to me, in response to the colleague who just made a remark about what the Internet was invented for, it was invented for defence purposes, and now it's evolving into a public utility like electricity and tap water. So it needs to pick up the values and the benefits for society that public utilities are supposed to respect, including human rights. So maybe the phrase you were looking for a few moments ago is human rights based. Unfortunately, that's too long, but if you can think of a short way of saying that, that would be good.
Thank you. And could you please introduce yourself just for the transcript?
Excuse me. Yes, Winston Roberts from New Zealand.
This discussion takes me back to the Net Mundial Internet Governance Principles, in which human rights were a very big component of that, as was security, stability, and resiliency of the Internet. Actually, what I want to do is respond to Teresa's comment about, where's this going and how does it evolve, if I may, because I know we're running out of time. I helped ISOC with their Future Internet report, which they released in September. And one of the questions that we asked on the sidelines of that report when we were interviewing people was, should the core values of the Internet evolve? Will they evolve? Do they need to evolve? And this gets to the point in the paper which seems to suggest that we should consider these as static. And this was at an ICANN or IGF meeting. We asked these questions, and people didn't know. Quite frankly, many responded no, they shouldn't. They're absolutely essential for the survival of the Internet. Others responded, yes, they should, because we can't predict what the internet's going to look like in 3 or 5 years, and the other ones said it's totally unclear, and they didn't want to predict. So I think we have to leave some flexibility to anticipate that the internet will evolve. Whether or not that means the core values change is another discussion, but the paper seems to indicate at the moment that they're going to be somehow, unless I'm reading it incorrectly, Olivier, that it seems to read it as if they're kind of being, solidified as a set of core values that may not evolve and may not be added to. So it's just a comment in response to. And when you want to talk about the future, we can go to another.
Shiva Subramanian Muthusamy.
When we talk about values, we talk about what is inherent. For example, we talk about freedom, or we talk about the universal nature of internet. We talk about openness. How do you alter a value like universal? How do you alter a value like freedom? And how would you alter what is inherent? So if you go a little deeper and look at one of the more intrinsic human values, such as truth, do you think you can modify a value like truth? So what we talk about core values here is what is inherent, what is what has been part of it. It was not put into the internet, was not designed into the internet. It was inherent, it was there, it existed. And these values will continue forever. These values are timeless, and that is the notion that we've been trying to convey through our paper. Thank you.
Matthew? They're quite flimsy.
Yeah. I'm not suggesting that they would or should change. What I was merely saying was that in this survey that we were doing of these participants, people like us who use the internet, that it was very unclear in terms of whether or not they were, in fact, inherent, and maybe they did need to change. So I'm not proposing that they will change or could change. It's just I wanted to reflect that there was this uncertainty, which I think is important for us to think about.
Okay. The uncertainty was basically because these are concepts which are very difficult to articulate, and there is a continuous process of articulating the values, not modifying the values, but articulating the values and looking at it again and again.
Thank you, Shiva. Now, there's a sheet, by the way, that's going around the room at the moment with name and email address. If you wish to be put on the mailing list, please indicate so, so that we can continue the dialogue over on the Dynamic Coalition's mailing list. So where do we go from here? Do we add this core internet value? How do we call it? Do we call it freedom from harm? It's the second year running that we're stuck at this position of saying, well, are we putting a level of security that is required in networks today? We've heard from Winston that there is a need for this whole thing to evolve. The internet has changed. It's not just a few groups of people that knew each other anymore. You've got public utilities. You've got more and more devices being connected on there. And you've got more and more cases of high-profile hacking or malware going out there and causing millions of dollars worth of damage. Whilst at the same time, you do have this problem with wording the value itself so that it doesn't get used for other purposes than the intended purpose of preventing people from being harmed. But then there's always a thing, preventing you from being harmed can be interpreted in all sorts of ways. Where do we go from here? So I'm not sure we can find an answer today, unfortunately. I can certainly see we've had a little bit more movement forward, but it's a very tough question that we're addressing here. Matthew?
Okay. Hopefully others will suggest things. I don't think that Vince and I are in a disagreement about the end goal of what he's trying to achieve, which is freedom from harm. I think that's something we would all want to see. I think it may well be a semantic difference, and also how you try to be very precise in terms of talking about security, stability, and resiliency, which is partially addressed within the list of core values. So I don't think there's a, I mean, I completely agree with Vint that we have serious security issues and risks that we have to address. How we capture that, I think, may take some wordsmithing. So let me put an idea out there, which is perhaps, first of all, there's a suggestion at the end of the paper that this dynamic coalition needs to work more closely with the dynamic coalition on Internet of Things and other dynamic coalitions where principles or norms are also being considered. And I think that might actually bring some greater clarity to how these norms can evolve. And then I think you could go so far, and this is something just kind of off the top of the head, you could go so far as to use this as these norms, these core values as a scorecard, right? People are doing things or building things for the internet. You know, how do they measure up? We have a set of inherent core values. How do we use them? Maybe they are a measurement tool of sorts that can assess whether or not changes to the internet are actually consistently and have the, for example, user centricity at their core, for example.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. I had invited Martin Botterman, the chair of the Dynamic Coalition on the Internet of Things. Unfortunately, he's taken another panel at the moment, so he couldn't make it. But the IoT, the DC IoT, has presented in this IGF first a set of good practice policies for IoT, and they've introduced the concept, or proposing the concept of an ethical framework for IoT good practice. So I think that we should indeed speak to the DC IoT and perhaps even work together to try and get some kind of common work together, perhaps even introducing the ethical good practice thing. I was quite impressed with the paper as it was presented. Another thing that the DC has done last year, but we didn't do this year, was to look at the world as such and see if any of the core values were being breached and where they were being breached. Last year was a bit straightforward because there were several high-level or high-profile cases of breach of values. This year was a little more complex. The question is, should we continue doing this? And perhaps should we go even further than this, because there's so much going on the internet. It's very difficult for a single organization or a single small group of people to track these things. Should we go one step further and introduce the Core Values Observatory, where so looking very much in this sort of the example of what Wendy, forgotten her name, chilling effects. Wendy Seltzer, that's right, thank you. The Chilling Effects website, which put up all of these cease and desist letters on a website, and it was it was sort of provided by crowds and so on, so there was a framework, a website and so on, and people could submit letters and things. Could we have, or should we think of coming together with a proposal where we would have a website where breaches of core values could be registered by people around the world? And I have no idea whether we'd get an avalanche of such information and who would be curating it and how that would all work out. But it's just an idea thrown here on the floor and seeing if it gains any traction, if there's any interest in doing such a thing. Shiva?
First of all, on IoT's ethical framework, when it comes to core internet values, it's much bigger than having an ethical framework. It's like having core internet values as global internet reference standards, which are just reference to any policy making, and does it hurt this value, does it further this value, does it conform to this value? These are the questions policymakers have to fundamentally ask. And when it comes to the website, we were talking, and you were talking about an engine, building an engine, and if we have an engine which is well designed, like tweets that are tagged, wherever some news that happens which interferes with any of the core values, that engine would automatically pick up that tweet or Facebook post or whatever, and then that on one side of that, and on the other side, people could write and publish breaches, and so it could take several several different ways of taking shape. And so what we could do is we can get started and have this engine running, and then let's see what happens. And so that's a good move. That's a really good thing to do.
Yeah, thanks, Shiva. I think that automating this is going to be a bit challenging. I was just looking at it, and I see Andrew Sullivan stepping forward to build this, perhaps. Perhaps not.
My name is Andrew Sullivan. I don't speak for anyone, but I'm not stepping forward to build it. It seems to me that we have Wikipedia. The problem has already been solved. All we need to do is stand up a wiki engine, and people can put whatever they want there. I think one of the core internet values, of course, was that it was always distributed. Your network, your rules. You want to believe in these values, then go ahead. You don't want to believe in them, well, you don't have to participate. And that seems to me actually to be one of the key things, that if you're going to proceed with this sort of thing, then you have to embrace that value as one of the ways that you're going to work.
Yeah, thank you for this, Andrew. That's a good point. Any other comments on this? Matthew Shears.
There we go. Perhaps this has already been done, but it would be very interesting to see how these core values line up against other established and accepted values. I don't know if that has been done within the DC, because I think the weight of the values will be amplified if it can be shown that they are also the same or similar values as to those that have been adopted in different processes. So the obvious one that comes to mind is Net Mundial. Right. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Matthew. We haven't actually looked at the Net Mundial values and put them together. We have had a joint meeting last year where we invited Marianne Franklin from the Internet Rights and Principles Coalition, and it was clear that the Internet Rights and Principles was looking more at the sort of ethical values and so on, while we're just focusing on the technical values. But it's a good point to match them with the Net Mundial, so we'll take note of that as well. Time is going so fast, and we had a second half hour that we were supposed to spend on the organization of the DC. I've been chair for a couple of years now, and would like to build somehow a team of people that would be interested in bringing the dynamic coalition to the next level, including this project that we might be attempting to do on the observatory. It's difficult to ask for immediate thoughts on this, but I'd like to sort of throw an idea into the room as to whether there's any interest in creating maybe a core team or a leadership team of people from across the community that would be interested in not only sharing the workload, but also driving this forward, so we would have people in charge of different projects, because I can see certainly several projects that can open up from here. There is a sheet that is going around the room, so we will put you on the mailing list if you're interested in following up on this. But I'm not planning to be chair forever. I'm ready to stay for another year. But after that, I think there needs to be a good team of people that can take this further and expand its work and take it to a level where we have not the same discussion every year, because I'm a little concerned we got stuck on this freedom from harm thing for a while, but actually expand and do projects and so on that go further than just listing the core internet values as they currently are at the moment. Any thoughts or suggestions as to where we can move from here? This is a very open call here. Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, hello. This is Sridip from Nepal. And we recently did a survey among the young people about the awareness and use of internet and how internet youth leadership is struggling. And most of the people came up with the idea that the current problem was the challenges that they face was with internet core values, especially in the South, South Asia. So I think we need to work towards creating, bridging those barriers, including all the stakeholders, as well as the diversity is a must. And the core values that we have, the 4 set of core values, internet core values that we have, are currently good, but we further need to refine it and work with, as you said, different stakeholders, diversity we need to include, and we need to move forward with the effort and energy, surely.
Okay, thank you. Salanyeta Tamini Kawamaro. Oh, I'm out of practice on your name.
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, Olivia and the panel. Lovely to be here. I'd just like to add that ever since Windsurf sort of mentioned the need of core values at last year's IGF at Guadalajara, it triggered a whole bunch of discussions within the global community. And from the region that I'm in, when we had the Pacific Internet Governance Forum, it was something that we sort of emphasized. And in relation to your call as to your proposition in terms of gathering the stakeholders, I'd like to raise my hand in my personal capacity and also to nominate some organizations that I think might be interested in lending a hand as well. And congratulations on the initiative.
Okay, thank you, thank you for this, Sala. Any other volunteers? Maybe not asking for volunteers right now, but any other thoughts as to our way forward for the next year? Okay, very snowy day today. Oh, Werner Staub.
Sorry. I'm a little bit worried that what we currently have in the core values, even though this is a consensus, misses out on things that I'm not the only one to feel that there's something really wrong and it's not being addressed in the core values. Maybe the reason is we have been attempting to do the core values on a rights basis. I, as an individual, have a right to. But mostly what I have as a problem with the internet nowadays is not my rights. It is the fact that other people are being misled. And I don't see anything like the old-fashioned word of honesty. It is not in the core values. But let's say an environment of honesty is what we somehow need. And I'm not sure how to build it, but let's, if you talk about the scorecard, the idea of a scorecard, and what's the behavior of parties? Do they contribute to an environment of honesty, or do they subtract from it? And just give you an example of how we live that. When you get a message on a mobile phone that says application such and such wants to do this, is that an honest question? How many people are responsible for the question and what the consequences are? Not if I press, but what are the consequences on me if millions of other people press yes, I'm okay with this, without understanding what they're doing. That's going to have many consequences on me and others, of course. And this is something we have to be able to have something like a scorecard to hold companies to account. I think mostly are companies that have to be held to account of what they do in that respect.
Thank you, Werner. It sounds like there's the word trust in here somewhere. Matthew Shears.
I was just going to say the same thing, Olivier. I think that's one of the words that we're hearing a lot these days is the notion of trust. And perhaps it's also a nice term because it not only applies to the situation that you've just described, but it also applies to the more fundamental ability to trust the network. And so it might be a good term, a bridging term in that sense.
Thank you, Matthew. Shiva.
On the way forward, apart from going ahead with significant projects, there are certain responsible things to do. This coalition includes internet community leaders who understand internet, who created the internet, and who know what harms the internet and what does not. The responsible thing to do is to educate, not educate, I wouldn't use the word educate, but interact with the top policymakers and then impart our understanding of core internet values about what makes the internet what it is, and that is one thing to do. And then when some serious harm happens in terms of legislation or a policy move in some corner of the world which could affect the rest of the world, then it is also becomes a responsible thing for the coalition to get involved and try and stop the harm from happening. That should be the next level of activity in core internet values.
Thank you, Shiva. Would holding stakeholders accountable be something that can translate into what you were saying, Werner? And what you're mentioning here, Werner Staub?
Yes, that's what I mean.
All right, well, we've reached the top of the hour already. It's gone very, very fast indeed. We only have 1 hour, unfortunately, for this session. We've got the sheet that's been going around, so I'll be contacting you maybe next week and providing you with the ability to get on the mailing list, or if you want to be on the mailing list, please just add a cross next to your name on the sheet. I think the sheet is in that corner now. And I'd like to thank Matthew Shears for having joined us, to thank Vince Cerf, but unfortunately he had to leave early, but at least, you know, he brought forward the concept of freedom from harm forward. And I hope that you'll all remain involved with the DC and we can meet next year to take things further. Think about this core values observatory thing. And if you do have any ideas on the resources that we would need for this and whether there could be any organizations that would be happy to help with resources for the DC, we don't have any income or anything like that, then please step forward. And perhaps one last word from the lady in the corner.
Well, good morning, Honorable Chair. I have a question for you, and that is, how would you teach the young people to respect core internet values?
Matthew Shears.
Okay, that is a great question. And I'm going to give you a very kind of obvious answer, but it's something we should talk about more because we've run out of time. But it is about educating. You know, we talk a lot about educating kids about cyber hygiene, but this is actually perhaps even fundamentally more important than that, or as important as cyber hygiene, which is understanding what really drives the internet and what makes it successful. So it's a great question. Thanks.
Thank you. And Sébastien Bachelet, the last word, no? Okay, thanks. Well, thanks everyone for coming here, and see you next year. And please, we'll see each other on the mailing list. So see you on the internet, as Vint likes to say. This meeting is adjourned. And just with apologies for people who are following us remotely, apparently they can't hear us or couldn't hear us. I don't know whether they can now. Yes. Okay, so apologies for this. This is a problem outside our control, and I think that there's also a problem with the scribe as well, scribing somebody else's thing, the transcript, yeah. So anyway, thank you.
But one of the problems was the fact that we have two sound at the same time, sound coming from outside of the room and the sound from the rooms, and it was very difficult to hear you. And it must be something we need to be fixed, because if we are going to have that for the whole IGF, we will never come back.
The number of machines that they have are limited. I want to work on this. I should be